Well, hello, Thomas, and many thanks for joining us on the ATG podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you here today. Perhaps by way of introduction, can you start off by telling us a little bit about RePEc?
Well, RePEc is really a digital library for economics. Now, a library is really two things. I mean, it's a set of data and a way of using the data. So at the heart of RePEc is an open source collection of metadata about economics publications and about the realities that contribute to these publications. Essentially, the authors and the institutions that are involved in the process.
Well, one thing about economics that intrigues me is I noticed that there's many references to working papers in economics, and I'm intrigued. What are these working papers?
Well, working papers are early accounts of research that are issued by institutions who are active in the research process. And this has become so commonplace that if your institution doesn't produce a working paper series, you're under the suspicion that you don't produce research. But it's not just simply research published in universities. It's also in central banks or in other international institutions like the OECD or the World Bank or the IMF or something like that. So they produce working papers. I don't know where the tradition of working papers comes from. I only know that when I got active in economics research in the early 1990s, that they were all in printed form. They were exchanged between departments on a I show you mine, you show me yours basis, basically. So they were photocopied, okay, and then they were given usually some sort of common cover to them so that they looked like a series. Then they were mailed and then they were put in boxes, and then they were usually in the coffee room. There would be these boxes on the wall with the working papers from various institutions. So these are working papers, right? And so I became interested in disseminating them in electronic format as soon as this was possible. And in fact, already before it was possible. And I published the first ever electronic working paper in economics.
Is working papers unique to economics, do you think, or are there other domains where these kind of papers exist?
I obviously am not a specialist on scholarly communication, various domains, but from my limited knowledge, there were basically two working paper disciplines. Right, there were computer science and there was economics. Now, the working papers in computer science have all but disappeared. The working papers in economics have stayed. I believe, well, of course I would say that is because of RePEc, right? Because of my work creating RePEc and then keeping the working paper tradition alive in the digital age. That didn't work in computer science. I mean, computer scientists tried to do this, but they weren't as successful as we are. And I believe that working papers have disappeared.
So do you think the working papers, I mean, RePEc is a remarkable success. It's bigger, I'm sure, than you can ever have imagined would have happened. Do you think it's the working papers that were the key to its success? I mean, what do you think made RePEc so successful?
Well, I mean, the working papers clearly are a big part of this. And I think one of the reasons to think about this is why are working papers so important? Well, economics is a discipline that is very hard on itself. It takes a very long time to publish anything. Right? People try to get into top journals, and at the time when I was research active, which is almost 20 years ago, but at the time it took about 4 years from the submission to a journal and the publication in that same journal. Now, okay, that is if you're a clever researcher, a really good one, right, who gets in the first journal they are getting to, right? Okay, if you are getting a rejection in the top journal, then you're going to try to go down the tier of journals, and it may take 10 or 15 years, until your paper gets, well, in the worst case, gets published. It takes a very long time. As a result of that, formal journal publication has essentially an archival character. right? So if you want to be staying abreast of what's going on, you need to have access to the working papers, right? And think about it. At the time of printed working papers, you need to be in one of those institutions who got sent the papers, and then you need to find the paper and so on. You need to be able. As a result, you have a lot of insider networks, and much of these internet networks were, based in the top institutions in the United States and so on. And I was not, and I was a B-rated place in the United Kingdom. So obviously, this put these people at a disadvantage.
Fascinating. So do you think it's true to say that RePEc is like the equivalent of archive for economics?
No, I don't think so. I mean, no, it's something completely different. I mean, it's something completely different from the get-go, from the start. It's completely different. There was, when I started with RePEc, there was a competitor who saw the archive, got Ginsparg's software, installed it on his box, and created the Economics Working Paper Archive. That was meant as a central storage for working paper, just in a way as archive was for physics. And he sent an ambassador to London, and that ambassador tried to convince me I should stop, but I didn't. What I did, however, I did create an email list for the discussion of all these issues, and then yes, we had regular arguments where we couldn't agree on anything except that we need to have an argument about this topic. That was Bob Parks. So yes, so basically, yeah, Bob Parks at a certain point. First of all, Bob Parks contributed to RePEc because in some ways it was different, right? So you could have a centralized working paper archive, and that would contribute to RePEc, right? So it's something like a superstructure to a potential coexistence of a large number of archives, all being housed by institutions. So it has nothing to do with archive. It's more like a precursor to the OAI, so to institutional repositories. It is a first set of institutional repositories, and it's possibly the only set of institutional repositories that has ever been widely accepted by the discipline.
It's fascinating. So what you're describing is a kind of distributed system rather than one big central server.
Correct. It is distributed, but it's also centralized in the way that you can gather all of the data, and then you can centralize it, and then from that centralized deposit of that data, then you can create RePEc services. So the idea really coming in the 1990s was that RePEc is going to be many archives forming one data set that can be used in multiple services. That was revolutionary 30 years ago, and it still is, because I've just not been particularly good at exporting what is a relatively intricate theory, right? So I tend to do stuff that is right, but rather than obvious.
But it seems to me that the more I learn about RePEc, the more innovative it seems. It's been around for many years, but there are so many things, and I hope we can touch on them today, of where RePEc came up with something new that was followed by other services later. So let's just let's just compare it with. I believe RePEc came before Google Scholar and other aggregated collections. So in what way is it different to something like Google Scholar?
Well, Google Scholar is really a search engine. So Google Scholar does, as far as I know, does not have a database behind it. So it's just a search engine. So it's very different. It's basically a library service without a library, right? So it's very different from Google Scholar. Yes, and the RePEc was done at the time when Google Scholar wasn't available. I started with RePEc basically in 1993. Google itself, I think, came only on market in the late 90s or so. And the first economics working paper I published on a Gopher server, so it was even before the web. So yes, so it goes back a long while. Now, having said that, yes, it's been pioneering, because at the time it was easier to do pioneering stuff because the internet came along and there was a lot of change that came through it. Okay, so it was easier to do pioneering stuff than it is today, where a lot of roads have already been well trodden. It was, and it is true that other interdisciplinary services have been catching up with stuff that RePEc has been doing before. Critically, there the idea of author registration. So I was the first person to ever create an author registration service. That is now done mainly by ORCID. Unfortunately, it's not open, right? So it's something that is dominated by the publisher's interest and so on. So it's different. What I was doing was an author registration, so it's not really an author identification, so we can talk about this for a while. So yes, so there are things where others have caught up with, but yeah.
You could describe RePEc, well, I think you could describe RePEc as part of open science today, but I'm not even sure if there was a concept of open science when you created RePEc. Did you have that goal? I mean, was that part of the vision?
Well, I mean, in 1999, a disciple of mine, Kit Baum, and I did apply to the NSF for funding of a dataset collection, which we were calling DATEC at the time. We were funding for dataset, software collections, and for the start of peer reviewing services, all based on RePEc. So we intended to do this. We had a grant proposal. That grant proposal was rejected, and I have an idea as to why.
But do you think that was it part of your vision initially to make science, to make economics open, because RePEc is largely freely available and freely usable?
But it's not largely; it is freely available. It is completely freely available. What we do, yes. So it was always able. It was always going to be open. It was always going to be freely available. So the question is, does this include research inputs, right? And at this time, it doesn't. It does include some software, but it does not include data sets at this time. And at the moment, there aren't any plans to do data sets. I mean, making data sets available is somewhat difficult because there aren't the incentives to do so. If you spend a long time putting your data set together, then it's difficult. I mean, it's not particularly, unless you push to do it by funders or by journal requirements, you're not going to have good incentives to make that data available for somebody else then to use it in a competing research paper. Yes. That's unfortunately a situation, right? So there hasn't been a lot of progress on this, I believe, but I'm not sure because I'm not following this area very closely these days.
No, I think you're right. Data throws up lots of issues which are a challenge for conventional repositories. They're different kind of beasts. You mentioned author registration, which, as you say, predated ORCID, but you also introduced subject classification, I think, very early on.
Yeah, in fact, the very, very early idea for RePEc came from publishing already existing lists of working papers and making them available via listservs, which was the internet precursor tool that was available in the UK in the early 1990s. We didn't even have internet access in the early 1990s at that time. So I came back to that idea in 1998, and I created NEP New Economics Papers, where, yes, I take the working paper stock of RePEc, make it available to subject-specific editors. And these editors are then classifying the data. I mean, they're called editors, but what they really do are selectors. They're selecting papers for reports, and they bring out these reports. Correct, and they do this on a weekly basis.
Is this part of the current awareness service? Because I think that was another innovation that you set up.
Well, correct. So basically, this is a current awareness service. I mean, this is the boring name that librarians give to this sort of service, right? It is a current awareness service. It was done on working papers at the working paper stock. It has stayed with the working paper stock for the reason that I've mentioned, right? So if you wanting to have new papers, well, they essentially have to be working papers, because a paper that is published is not new, right? So yes, so that is true. So I've had an interest in current awareness that goes back to the early 1990s and has continued to this day.
And in addition to that, I believe you include a ranking of economists, but isn't ranking of academics quite a contentious area?
Well, I mean, there are various ways to rank, right? I mean, if you take RePEc data, then RePEc data has a bunch of evaluative components to it, right? So we have, despite the fact that we have a distributed system and we have many services working on it, the majority of these services collaborate in a system called LogEc. That means they collect the logs from various RePEc services and they put it into an aggregate across these. These can then be used to measure the popularity of economics researchers, but you can also aggregate them per person. Now you may say that this is controversial, and I remember I was at a meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and this guy was sitting there, and he was saying, okay, this is the RePEc ranking, average RePEc ranking of these people with this salary classification class, and this is the average ranking of the people in this classification class, and he had all of these things sussed out from the data that he gathered from RePEc, and I came up with my disciple, Christian Zimmerman. He told me, we have created a monster. Well, yeah, I mean, rankings have to be taken with care. I mean, but I think that rankings are an observable, objective fact. What you make out of them is your determination. So, rankings are very important in economics, and they're an extremely important driver for participation in RePEc because people want to improve their rankings. If there are no rankings, then people won't bother to contribute. So, I mean, without these rankings, we can't do it. I mean, you can condemn the rankings, but your open access won't be driven because people don't have the motivation. Think about it. These people are economists. They're rational and they are selfish, right? This is basically the picture of the world that economists have, right? And they behave accordingly. So if you don't have the incentives, they won't do the work.
I should add for our listeners that you're a former economics lecturer, so you know whereof you speak, I trust. Well,
yes, I mean, I am a trained economist, right? Yeah. So I was an economics professor until 2001.
Fascinating. Can you just tell us the ranking of economists? Is it how's it calculated? Is it citation based, or is there another metric?
No, there are various metrics. I don't know what they are and how they work. You really have to ask my disciple Christian Zimmerman about this. I don't know. Make an interview with Christian Zimmerman. I can only recommend this. He doesn't usually talk to the library world. He would be a very interesting voice to interview about these things.
Yeah, I'll certainly follow it up. Another feature is that individual researchers can set up their own RePEc archive. What was the idea behind that?
No. Individual researchers don't set up archives. We've had this happening in the past, and we were not impressed by what the guy put into his archives. So we do not encourage people to open their own archives. No, I mean, obviously somebody can open an archive, but it always has to be from an institution. So this is very important for us because the institution imprint make sure that we have basic quality control over the material, so the people don't publish flat earth economics, because it not only damages themselves, it will damage their peers. Usually when you bring out a working paper in an institution, you'll get a colleague looking at it first. So there's a primitive quality control involved in this, and there is a reason for it. So we therefore have this distributed peer review system that is somehow implied in the paper being in RePEc.
Yes, which sounds like many other. I know that bioRxiv have some minimal quality control for papers going in.
That's different because we also do this. But it's in a subpart of RePEc. There is something known as the Munich Personal RePEc Archive. So this is like arXiv. Basically, it's the successor to the economics working paper archive that Barks ran in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. This is run at Munich University Library. They run ePrints. You can submit your paper there if you don't have a RePEc archive in your institution. And these are then go through some subject editors who have a look at these papers. Correct that this exists.
Well, all in all, this is a remarkable system, and it sounds like a huge number of people involved with it. How is RePEc financed?
No, there aren't a huge number of people. Well, actually, there are a huge number of people involved with it at the stage where archives are being maintained. There's about 2,000 archives. So obviously there's a lot of people who are involved in producing this. So, but that cost is decentralized. So if you maintain a RePEc archive, right, I mean, you're assuming the cost of maintaining that RePEc archive. That archive that cost is essentially decentralized. It is absorbed in the running cost of your institution. So that doesn't really need funding. There are obviously things like the economics, the Munich archive. They are funded by the university library there. But there's only a small group of volunteers that are really core to the system. That's me. It's about 5 or 6 people. It's me, there's Christian Zimmermann, there's Sune Carlson, there's José Manuel Barrico-Cruz, and Kit Baum. Essentially, there's about these 5 people, right? That they maintain, to keep the whole thing together. And so we're all growing old. I mean, most of the other people are actually older than me. And so, yes, we have a problem with finding people who are going to be taking this over. So there are discussions with a group led by the Central Bank of France that are going to be providing us with funding. And there are discussions going on about this, so that we do not have to rely on volunteer work for the core services in as much as we are doing now.
So if I understand correctly, then the kind of distributed model, it sounds very sensible. It has lower operating costs than a sort of centralized service like Archive, because most of the costs, the cost of running the servers, are the costs of the institutions themselves who are having each of the repositories.
Well, the cost is distributed. Right, so the cost, what the cost is, we don't know what the total cost is. What we know, if you run a service like Archive that has, staff and so on, and you has a server and so on, you know what the cost is. We do not even observe our cost, right? I mean, yeah. So obviously, the cost of running a system like that is much lower. In terms of its centralization, and the central cost of coordinating is quite low. And this, I believe, is the original intent behind Open Archives. I mean, when Herbert started the Open Archives initiative, I believe that he really had the role model of RePEc in mind. At least that's what he told me.
So do you think you mentioned that the Central Bank of France are a single institution that's going to sponsor the RePEc going forward? Do you think that's a sustainable model? Do you think that's a long-term viable model?
Well, I don't know what a long-term viable model is. We will be. I mean, I think there will at some stage there will be a growing realization across universities that you are not just going to be making a reputation by producing research, but also by hosting or managing or building research assets and so on. And we will still be around, and I believe that somebody is going to be taking it over in some ways. I mean, I intend to leave everything that I own after my death to an organization. I haven't selected whom to fund activities related to RePEc. So that would be one source. That's one way, that I will contribute.
Yeah, it seems that with such an achievement as RePEc, this unique service, which with all the sort of all the qualities that you describe, it seems like a logical thing to try and ensure it's continuing in years to come as the original generation sort of move to retirement, and to make sure that it's sort of it's sustainable.
Well, sure, but as I know, I can't foresee the future. I mean, it is something that is on the agenda for us. We're looking into this. I believe that the really important step for us is to collect full text and to make RePEc really like a publisher. I've been working on this already. I've been interrupted by other work that I did in my second love child. But I this is something I think we have to do more work on, and so RePEc will no longer be a library of links, but it will actually be a publisher, so that the working papers that are published will be archived and then can't be removed. That is going to be a slow process. I mean, in the current version of RePEc is actually not really immediately open. You can download it, but you need to know where to get it from. So it's not something that, I mean, it's available on Rzync, so you can get all these papers. But yes, in the long run, this is a way for us to change the quality of what we're doing, which I hope that I will be able still to drive forward. But I'm approaching 60. So.
Comparing RePEc with other models, and again going back to archive, what's intriguing is that RePEc had such great success. When you look at preprint servers, particularly domain-based ones, you've got SSRN in social sciences, archive for physics, computing, bioarchive. But after that, most preprint servers have never really sort of reached kind of critical mass. So why do you think that is? RePEc is very much dominant in economics.
Yeah, I mean, we had competition from SSRN, which was initially an economics research network. So, but we pushed them out. Essentially, they've grown in other areas, right? So, so we had a difficult relationship with them. You remember that I mentioned the 1990 funding application. We sent a letter from a lawyer where SSRN threatened the NSF with a lawsuit if they were to fund us. So obviously, it's not funny. So we didn't have a very good. I mean, we had a difficult relationship with them. And again, the issue of SSRN is that it is a company, it is a centralized deposit, right? That is never what economists did. They always submitted working papers, and it was always a decentralized system. Now, if you're looking back into the 90s, you had Bob Parks with a centralized system, you had RePEc with a decentralized system. The decentralized system won. Okay, so why does it not take off in other areas? Well, there are institutional repositories. Okay, most institutions have an institutional repositories. Why it is not populated much? Well, my guess it doesn't get enough resources being put to it. That if you spend as much on your, if you were to stop spending money on publishers and you would spend it on your institutional repositories and on supporting disciplinary cross-institutional repository aggregates, such as RePEc, for example, or other things that would be specialized to a certain discipline, where you would gather digital resources from a variety of institutions to create a center of excellence in your university, then the situation would be much better. But unfortunately, libraries keep on spending on publishers. That's what they do. I mean, I've been, and it's not the publisher's fault. It's the library's fault to keep on doing it.
I think also perhaps one of the interesting things about RePEc is this intriguing situation with about peer review. Again, I think this is an example of RePEc being a pioneer because if I understand correctly the way you describe working papers, these are not really peer-reviewed papers. These are papers circulated, although they've got the they've been checked for credibility. They're not peer-reviewed in a formal sense, I believe.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there is the informal peer review that I described for an institutional working paper that usually involves somebody else reading it. I mean, that was the case where I worked. I mean, other institutions may handle it in different ways. I don't know. There is some minimal peer review. Beyond that, there isn't, because the discipline still relies on the journals to do this. It will take a very long time for this process to complete. But if you're getting a paper in a top journal in economics, your career is essentially assured. I mean, I know a guy who got I got my first job without a PhD. Right, I got without a PhD just because I had one single paper in a reputable journal. Okay, that's how I got my profession. I had no teaching experience. Well, when they asked me why was I going to be a great teacher, I said, oh, it's because I have a loud voice. That's all I could credibly say. And then, yeah.
Wonderful.
They put me in an auditorium that seated 800 people, and there were 20 people in the class. We were spread all around this huge hall. Oh yeah, Thomas, you have this great voice.
A good voice was very essential. Back comparing economics with the domain I'm most familiar with, which is computing. I think it's probably true to say that archive has become almost the de facto the destination of choice, and the whole progress of AI and computing tends to happen via preprints, with the publication in journals almost just being that sort of the version of record. Is the same true in economics?
Well, I mean I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about archive, there are a part of our papers relevant to economics that are stored in archive. Archive run a RePEc archive for us, so they contribute to RePEc, right? Okay, so they do. But it is not true that the economics working paper archive of RePEc, the Munich personal RePEc archive, has had the same extent of success. No, it does not. So people are not depositing in a centralized archive facility.
Yeah.
So this model has failed in economics. Did it fail because of RePEc? Potentially, that's the reason why. I don't know. I mean, we can't rewind history. So
I wouldn't describe it as a failure. I'd describe it maybe as a feature. It's a sort of a model which perhaps the other services haven't might well one day emulate.
Well, I'm just saying I mean, the idea behind institutional repositories was the idea behind RePEc. It's just that, the incentives weren't there because people did not have a working paper culture. So it was not something that is in there. And then OAI came up with this reference, this model for how to do a research, do an archive. And I was part of the technical group that put this together. I was against what they did, but they were all the computer scientists, and I was just an economist. What do I know? Oh, I know nothing. Well, the problem is that it's I believe the whole OAI PMH is an expensive digital ritual. So it added to the expense. Not that university libraries would have that sort of thing, but it is tied in the money going to the publishers, so it doesn't work. So you're not comparing like and like in a way.
OAI PMH has got its shortcomings, but it's certainly got longevity. It's been going for 20 years or more. Well,
it's a protocol.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you publish a protocol and the protocol is published and it goes along. Similarly, in RePEc, yes, we have a metadata standard and we have a way to exchange the data. These protocols that are underlying RePEc, I wrote them in 1997. So, and these protocols are essentially there unchanged. So yes, this is longevity for you, and there's but things have moved on, and I think they have to move on, and there is still work to be done. So yes, if anybody out there, wants to be part of this, happy to contribute. Happy to contact me.
You mentioned that you're still involved with RePEc. Does that take up most of your time now, or what do you do now?
I do a lot of work on something else, where I take the idea of current awareness, right, that I started in the 1990s. Remember, I wanted to disseminate the working papers, the list of acquisitions of working papers via electronic mail, which was the only way of doing it at the time. I believe archive started in a similar way with a mail system, so you emailed your LaTeX file and then it was distributed via email. I remember that I set up NEP, the New Economics Paper System, right? That New Economics Paper System was also a current awareness system. So then in 2004, the growth of RePEc implied that it was no longer possible, or it was going to be, well, in the early 2000s, we had the growth of RePEc. Then I started thinking forward, since I'm a forward-thinking kind of chap. And said at some stage it's going to be too difficult and too much work for people to manually go through the list of new working papers every week. So we need to have an artificial intelligence system that would pre-sort them. That's what I set up in 2004. So in 2004, I set up an artificial intelligence system. It was the first information retrieval system that was based on artificial intelligence and that does not use any query, it doesn't use any searches, right?
How did it work?
It's purely based on artificial intelligence. Well, it is work by observing the past issues that an editor brings out. So in the past issues, we'll say, well, these are the papers that are selected. These are the papers that have not been selected. Here are the characteristics of selected papers. Here are the characteristics of the non-selected papers, and then it uses a computational technology to develop a set of a ranking over the incoming papers every week based on the previous selections. That is really, it's not rocket science, but it is artificial intelligence, and I believe it's the first such system in 2004. Yes, that was ever brought out. I mean, there was research done in interest profiles, so people could say, okay, here's my interest profile, and send me current awareness using this interest profile. But there was essentially stored queries. So you would say, okay, my keywords are this and that, and then it would make these searches every week and would send you out the results. It was not an artificial intelligence system. And to do an artificial intelligence system, you really need to have somebody who's dedicated in doing this every week, so that you actually get the data on which you're going to be doing your artificial intelligence on.
Mm-hmm. So. Talking of artificial intelligence, have you had much chance to look at generative AI? What do you think of the latest tools?
I don't know. No, I don't do much generative AI. So to come back to your other thing, as I was started to say about the artificial intelligence in 2004, the second project that I'm doing now, which is a system based on PubMed. So what I have in NEP is basically an artificial current awareness system based on artificial intelligence on RePEc working papers. I'm now doing the same thing on PubMed, right? So, and that is called a system called BIMS Biomed News. So it's a system that is no longer based on my own digital library, but on an external digital library which is supplied by PubMed. Right?
Isn't that quite a challenge in that this is a completely separate domain? So now you haven't got your subject expertise, and you're looking at a sort of a life science where you're kind of starting from scratch.
Yeah, and sure. I couldn't really couldn't have done that without having a life scientist with me, because I know as much about life sciences as a cow knows about flying. So that's why I started. That's why I started this project so late. I mean, I need to have to find the life scientists, And I went out in New York and in one of those meetings for alumni of British universities, and I got very drunk, and there was another guy who got very drunk, but he was he confessed to me that that he was a life scientist, and I grabbed down his contact details and sent him an email that night. And yes, and then we had a second meeting about a month later where we were both sober. We walked in Central Park for an hour and a half. I bombarded the poor chap with arguments to the point where he raised a white flag and says, I'm going to try it out. Okay. Now, of course. Now, this may sound funny, but of course, I couldn't have done this without doing prep work. So that means by taking what I have done for economics and set up a system that would reasonably quickly be transformed into something else that would be suitable for PubMed, right? I also have been working with PubMed data for a while already, so I know the ins and outs of downloading and indexing PubMed data from PubMed. So I have this stuff ready. So it didn't take me all that long to do, and he has been running BIMS ever since. He's essentially my boss. He's the director. I'm just the guy who founded it and works on the technology.
Sounds to me, if you've done it for two domains, then potentially it could be rolled across many others as well.
Well, the problem again, the problem again is one of human involvement in this. If you think about it, when I created RePEc, people were publishing working papers. All I did was to take the working papers in published form and bring them out in electronic form and build a bibliographic data set with it and so on and so on. So all of this stuff has been going on for a while. If you're thinking about a person who would work in Biomed News, who would be reviewing incoming research papers every week, that is a new role, but something that didn't exist before. So we're talking about the new social reality that I call an expertise sharing system, where I tell people, look, you need to know about the new papers, but rather than doing this for yourself, where nobody knows that you're doing it, that you're studiously keeping up to date, you're actually creating a public record of what you're doing, right? And then you can be recognized as an expert, because as an expert you need to stay abreast of the field, but I'm giving you the possibility to do that, and at the same time to make it known, okay, that you're doing this. However, I mean, academia is an exceedingly conservative environment. Is exceedingly conservative. People who are in the life sciences are very much in a rat race. It's extremely intense. The competition for funding and so on is absolutely insane, right? I listened to the interview with Bianca, right? I mean, just that you did it. People just, if you do this sort of thing, that this is your life. I mean, there isn't a life outside, essentially, right? I mean, and so finding people to do this is a huge challenge, particularly if you're not representing an entity that is known. I'm not Harvard University or whatever. I'm just a little guy somewhere, okay? And my organization nobody knows about, and so on. So we only can do word of mouth, essentially. And we do have a core usership, around the ideas of the mitochondria and about cancer and so on, that there appears to be some sort of a concentration in. So once we've filled this, and we have a lot of reports in this particular area, expanding into other areas seems to be difficult. And one of the reasons for that potentially is people look at the existing reports and say, well, it's for mitochondria people. I'm not a mitochondria guy, so I'm not going to do it. So that's where you get a saturation point from, there's just, and that's where open access actually hinders you, right? I mean, it's also we can't really claim that our system is used by millions of people, as other of these startups say we're the hottest thing and so on. Everybody who's really cool does this, because everything that we do is publicly available, so we can't make up usage we don't have, right? So.
Nonetheless, I get the feeling that you're achieving with the tools you have available what many of the generative AI systems are only now achieving, which is the sort of like a sort of current awareness in specific domains, produced in a semi-automated way.
Not really. I mean, here's this critical difference, and the critical difference comes from the understanding of what current awareness is about. Current awareness is not knowing the state of the field. This is what generative AI would do for you. So you want to know what's the state of knowledge on this, and a generative AI will tell you what the state of knowledge is on this. This is not what BIMS is about. BIMS is about the change in the state of knowledge. So that's very different. Right? We're not interested in the state of knowledge. The person using it is the expert. He or she already knows what the state is. So what they're interested in is the changes in this state of knowledge. Meaning what? Meaning that this is not an artificial intelligence tool. It is a tool against artificial intelligence, right, in a way. Because the papers that are at the top of the pile in this artificial intelligence selections are the papers that will say the same thing as has been said before. Because we can only train our machine learning on the past. Okay? Yeah. But what we're interested in is what is new. This is not the papers that are at the top, but the papers that are still relevant, but are somewhat deeper below. That's why it has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. It can't really, a generative AI does not replace this, because the generative AI is great for searches where somebody comes anew into the library and wants to know what you have. It is not good in this specialized area of current awareness that really is quite specific to academia. Right? It's not reproducible anywhere else, essentially, right? So this particular aspect of current awareness.
Understood. I'd like to close by asking you, you're clearly an innovator and a pioneer, and a lot of what you achieved took place around the year 2000, which I think was I think you could say the world goes through periods of innovation and then kind of retrenchment. Do you agree?
No, I mean, yes. What I did what I did 1990 to 2000 was potentially where I did most of my work. But I've done work on setting up an interdisciplinary authorization service after that, which failed. And I'm doing BIMS now. BIMS Biomed News is a technically very sophisticated system. It's the most technically sophisticated system I've ever done. And it's, as I said, it has a new social component. So I don't think that I'm retrenched and a spent force yet. Not quite. But the uptake of BIMS is rather disappointing. It is true.
No, I mean, Thomas, we all of us we are innovators or consolidators, and I think a lot of it is down to the if you like, the society we're based in, and external attributes. And I think there are periods when it surprises me how often things changed around 2000. There was so much innovation going on there, and following that there's been maybe as an innovator yourself, you'll continue to innovate, but
I disagree. I mean, the innovative period came 1990 to 2000. It came with the introduction of the internet. At that point, the internet was exciting. Nowadays, the internet is boring or a nuisance, or it is a challenge in many aspects, right? So at that point, there was the excitement. And at that point, somebody who was from a back part of the world, whatever. I mean, not at the forefront, not in a big institution, could create something really quite new, relatively easy in that exceedingly conservative space that is academia. Now, people continue to innovate with new stuff in spaces that are not as conservative, right? So where uptake is much quicker. But in academia, the uptake has always been very slow. People who work in academia are very focused on their work and on what they do, their subject matter. They tend to compensate by behaving very conservatively in any social matters surrounding that particular work.
Well, I'm confident that however conservative academics may be, I don't think there's any danger of you acting in a conservative way. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you in the last hour or so, and I think I'm more impressed by RePEc now. Now I've heard more details about how it was put together and what it does than when I started. So thanks again for joining us.
Interview Christian Zimmermann. He will tell you more. He will put him on your list. Put him on your list. Interview him. He will have a lot of interesting things to say about RePEc after 2000. I mean, a lot of involvement that I have had was up until 2000 creating. He is doing a lot of work on it right now.
Sounds fascinating.
So,
I'll certainly follow it up. Thank you again, Thomas.
Okay. All right. Smashing.
Thanks.
Goodbye.